In part 1 of this analysis, we explored the forensic and iconographic evidence that the Erdtree, as well as other flora, play key roles in producing new births in the world of the lands between. Having now established that there is this trope of linking birth to the power of sacred trees, and literally people being born or reborn by the life-giving power of these trees, we will now take a closer look at the religious practice that has developed around the wielders of this power, in order to understand the true source of Queen Marika's power, as well as of those that would seek to replace her. Of course, the main faction of tree birth, the orthodoxy, so to speak, would be Erdtree birth. Melina tells us that
I was born at the foot of the Erdtree, where Mother gave me my purpose.
And the golden rune descriptions state, quote, "Those born at the foot of the Erdtree are blessed. Even now, runes are still imbued with the power of life itself. Do you see the Erdtree towering over there?" End quote. The blessing of the Erdtree is life itself, and being blessed by the Erdtree means being born from it. So important is this creed that the developers modeled the Elden Lord's very throne and the chairs of the demigods after a 15th century chair, now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which depicts the Tree of Yashai that we discussed last episode. Not to mention this depiction is reproduced again and again on the tapestries, furniture, and doorways of the capital. So, finally, we arrive at the central question. What does it actually mean to be born from the Erdtree? Several item descriptions in-game attest to the Erdtree's preeminence and refer to a bygone era of free-flowing bounty, which we've been referring to as the Erdtree's Age of Plenty. For example, the Blessing of the Erdtree description reads, quote, "The Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life," end quote. While the Sacred Tear description mentions an age of the Erdtree in the past tense, establishing both the existence and the ephemeral nature of this era. The Blessed Dew talisman is even more explicit. Quote, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith," end quote. The icon shield gives us a clear visual of what this process would have looked like, depicting a scene from the Age of Plenty, with a divine blessing of golden sap bestowed onto a cloaked woman and collected into what we recognize as the Sacred Tear Chalice. What all of these items actually do, from the Sacred Tears to the Crimson Flask to the Blessed Dew Talisman or Icon Shield, is give life force, literally, in the case of HP, to those upon whom their blessing is bestowed. So, the Erdtree is literally the giver of life in the lands between, at least to those blessed by its grace, and we are told that it does so through its sap. From these descriptions emerges an image of the Erdtree during the Age of Plenty as a source of highly sought-after blessings, a religious practice developed around the collection and distribution of the Erdtree's bounty. But we can go beyond mere item descriptions for insight into the world of the Age of Plenty, as evidence of it lingers in the monumental architecture and iconography of Leyndell. Besides the tapestries and reliefs of the Tree of Yashai, which we covered in Part 1, there is another class of artifacts that draw from real-world history, which in fact also relate to childbirth. These are the ornate copper basins situated around the capital in prominent plazas. These basins are not fountains, as we know very well what the Leyndell fountains look like from in-game examples. Nor are they collection basins, as most of them are actually covered. So, what are they? Their likeness to the Sacred Tear Chalice and the in-game descriptions makes it clear that these ornate basins in Leyndell were once used to store the sap blessings of the Erdtree. These blessings were then bestowed by Marika to, quote, "spread the faith," end quote, according to the Sacred Tear and Erdtree's Favor descriptions. And actually, if we look closely at the Erdtree's Favor talisman, we can see a depiction of Marika pouring the sacred blessing of the Erdtree from her cup. This blessed bestowal scene is replicated throughout the old chapels of the lands between, leaving no doubt as to Marika's role as the bestower of blessings. As for Leyndell's copper basins themselves, they are quite clearly modeled after Christian baptismal fonts. In the real world, these fonts are not for receiving sap, of course, rather they are ritual basins for the storing of holy water, from which a new member of the faith emerges in the sacrament of baptism. Babies are placed inside the fonts where they become new Christians once anointed with holy water and sacramental oil known as chrism. Stay tuned for our upcoming episode on the chrism, Constantinople, and Perfumers. As it regards to Erdtree births, the developers appear to once again have drawn inspiration from real-world implements. In this case, the Byzantine-styled baptismal fonts, where a new member of the faith is symbolically created and ported to the lands between in a magical literal sense. This gives the notion of the Erdtree's blessing, bestowed by Marika, an entirely new meaning. From the life-giving sap dripping from the Erdtree and stored in the baptismal fonts throughout Leyndell, Queen Marika bestows blessings unto the faithful in the form of new life, spreading the faith, just as God bestows the blessing of a child. Perhaps this explains Marika's pose, seen in her icons and in the churches throughout the lands between, but best seen in a painting in the fortified manner, in which she appears to be embedded into the Erdtree itself, her body its trunk, her arms its branches. Just as the Erdtree's favorite talisman and the corresponding bestowal statues suggest, Marika's power quite literally comes from the ability to bestow these blessings. And, moreover, a certain Empyrean who would try to recreate the life-giving power of the Erdtree would, in time, embed himself in a suggestively similar fashion. But we'll return to that topic at the end of the video. On April 18, 2022, perfumers congregated at the Patriarchate of Constantinople in Istanbul, modern-day Turkey, just as they have for over a millennium. The Patriarch and the Lord Perfumer begin mixing the Holy Chrism to perform a ritual that happens once every 10 years. Indeed, the real-world perfumers of the Byzantine Empire's capital are the direct inspiration for the perfumers of Leyndell, both in function and in imagery. Perfumers are said to constitute the blessed apothecary of Leyndell, and they are quite clearly modeled after the Byzantine Orthodox officials, those who guard and acquire the secret ingredients to produce the Holy Chrism, a key part of the sacrament of baptism. In the real world, beyond their once-in-a-decade duty of preparing the chrism, the title of perfumer was bestowed on the physicians and apothecaries of the Byzantine Empire, similar to the role perfumers once had in Leyndell. Containers modeled after the characteristic jugs used for storing the chrism are found throughout Leyndell, as are the stoves used to heat and prepare the mixture. The perfumers of Leyndell would go on to use these very stoves to make poison aromatic projectiles during the shattering. But in the Age of Plenty, those fractious days of the shattering were the distant future, and the perfumers acted as sacred healers and holy men. Remember those baptismal fonts throughout Leyndell, where the holy rite of sacred tear baptism was performed? Well, as a matter of fact, we can see examples of Elden Ring's perfumers praying at several of these, almost as if lamenting a lost duty. In fact, at almost every one of these plazas, with the sacred tear baptismal fonts, there is a perfumer close by, along with his garden of herbs necessary for the production of the holy oils. So now we know that the ritual performed at these plazas by the Perfumers is a kind of baptism, for the production of a new member of the faithful. But how did they obtain the sacred tears in the first place? Well, a major clue has been right in front of us from the very first moments we stepped out of the stranded graveyard. The prominent gashes in the trunk of the Erdtree. These are highly suggestive of a specific process of harvesting sap, and more specifically, gum mastic from the famed mastic trees of the Greek island of Chios. From these trees flows a precious sap that has become the cultural and economic lifeblood of the island since antiquity. The cultivator scores each tree. From the scars, a sap starts to flow and is allowed to harden as it drips down the trunk, turning into what the islanders called tears. These tears are collected and carefully cleaned, traditionally by women wearing headscarves to protect themselves from the sun, reminiscent of the scarved maiden shown collecting the sacred tears of the Erdtree on the icon shield. The crystallized sap tears produce the island's white gold, sold throughout the world, including in Japan, as tears of Chios. These crystal sap tears have had many uses both in the ancient and modern world, from medicinal remedies to cuisine, but perhaps its most important role is one which we've already touched upon. While the exact recipe of the chrism is a closely guarded secret, some individual ingredients are known, including, you guessed it, the sacred tears of Chios. But, like all things, the Age of Plenty was fleeting. Such blessings no longer fall from the Erdtree in Leyndell. In the current era, the ornate basins are empty, implying a purely symbolic role after long falling into disuse. Now, only the corporeal minor Erdtrees produce tears, which are collected in the simple stone basins at their base. As the Flask of Wondrous Physic reads, quote, "A relic of the physic chemists, priests of the Erdtree, harnesses the powers of crystal tears, which form after the passage of many moons. Basins are placed at the feet of minor Erdtrees throughout the lands between in order to collect their crystallized tears." End quote. As we know, crystal tears are simply hardened, crystallized tree sap, and these simple stone basins are placed around the minor Erdtrees because, after the Age of Plenty had passed and the Erdtree burnt, these are the only remaining corporeal trees to produce sap. But where were they collected during the Age of Plenty? We don't see any collection basins anywhere in Leyndell, which is odd, to say the least. For such an important practice, it would be unusual for there to be no forensic evidence of the collection of sacred tears. Well, as we briefly discussed in the last video, it is these basins after which Marika's bed is modeled, and that realization brings the whole practice into focus. The reason we don't see any such collection basins in Leyndell is because Marika's bed is the Erdtree collection basin. So finally we are starting to see the whole picture. During the Age of Plenty, sacred tears would drip from the scored trunk of the Erdtree and be collected in Marika's bed, itself just a large version of a collection basin. No doubt this is why we find the Blessing of the Erdtree incantation in her bed. These blessings were then taken from the collection basin and stored in the baptismal fonts throughout the capital, where the ritual of Erdtree baptism and the production of new members of the faithful would take place. There is even a procession of slain finger readers in between the Queen's bedchamber and the adjacent baptismal fonts. Even today, perfumers recall their past role in this process, gazing nostalgically at the sites where they once used their holy chrism to anoint new members of the faith. When Melina says, quote, "I was born at the foot of the Erdtree," end quote, this is what she means. She's a member of the faithful, produced from the sacred tears of the Erdtree, collected in Marika's bed, and anointed with the concoction of the perfumers in the ritual baptismal fonts of the capital. Of course, you can't have an orthodoxy without its opposite, the heterodoxy or the heretical. And so, even at the peak of the cultural dominance of the Erdtree, some groups apparently lay outside its dominion over life and death. We know the attitude of the Golden Order towards those who reject Erdtree burial and recycling, but we'll save that story for another episode. For now, we'll focus on the groups who produced new births through heretical means. In the last episode, we discussed the process by which Millicent and her sisters are born from the scarlet bloom of Aeonia, but there are many more examples of heterodox birthing processes. For one, as Melena's dialogue about him indicates, Bach the demi-human was born from a mother, which marks him out as unusual to Melena. It's quite possible that what makes the demi-humans, well, demi-human instead of regular human, is that they are born by traditional copulation, a process which is considered heretical in the age of the Erdtree. It is certainly interesting to note the designation their leaders have as queens, apparently reflective not of a political designation, but of a matrilineal one, rather like a queen bee.
Do you think that Mum would be pleased if she knew that I'm as good as any royal seamster now? Oh, it's still not enough.
Perhaps Bach's obsession with his mother is due to the fact that demi-humans are one of the few remaining creatures in the lands between who are actually born from mothers. This certainly gives his tragic desperation to be reborn a new context. There are others still that insist on heretical birthing methods. For example, Raya was evidently born of a deeply heretical and, quote, repellent birthing ritual involving the serpent's amnion.
I was an unwanted child, born not of grace, but of a hideous ritual, something that can never be accepted.
We'll delve further into this ritual and Rykard's full ambitions in a future episode, but for now we'll just say that all the man-serpents in the Volcano Manor are apparently born of this process, a fact no doubt central to Rykard's ambitions of taking on the Erdtree and the Greater Will head-on. And upon death, Raya drops the Dedekar's Woe talisman, which reads, quote, "It is said that this woman, named Dedekar, indulged in every form of adultery and wicked pleasure imaginable, giving birth to a myriad of grotesque children." End quote. Once again, the act of actual sex, let alone childbirth, is wicked and despicable in the eyes of the Orthodox. And finally, according to their blood clot item, albinurics are apparently made by human hands, and therefore live without the Erdtree's grace. In each of these cases, it is because they were not born through the accepted Erdtree processes that they are without grace. Some are lied to and told that they were born of a Lord's grace. Others seek salvation in magical foreign lands. Some even exploit these facts of life to curse their victims. Whatever ritual the Dung Eater is performing when defiling his victims' corpses, quote, by doing so, he prevents dead souls returning to the Erdtree, leaving them forever cursed, end quote. So, he is able to prevent them from participating in the Erdtree Orthodox cycle of life, burial, and rebirth. And this is, quote, one of the most loathsome things found in the lands between. And he makes it quite clear this does not prevent them from being reborn at all. It merely prevents them from entering the Erdtree cycle.
And countless I have defiled, and soon the fruits will be born. Hundreds will be reborn cursed, and they'll bear thousands of cursed children.
The Dung Eater's victims are cursed to a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that is outside of the Erdtree orthodoxy. Such is the fate of those born outside the Erdtree's grace. No small coincidence, then, that the seedbed curse contains the horns of an omen. Number 277. When a fetus has 8 legs and 2 tails, the prince of the kingdom will seize power. Let us now return to the ritual of sacred tear baptism. Remember that in Christianity, baptism is for the remission of sins, to initiate a new member of the church and to ward off the influence of evil. We've all seen The Godfather, so we know that the most important question the godparents are asked during a baptism is, do you renounce Satan? By pronouncing these vows, submerging the newborn in holy water, aka sacred tears, and anointing him in the holy oil, aka chrism from the Perfumers, the parents initiate the newborn into the church and protect him or her from being controlled by evil. The Christian iconography of devils and demons has well-known pagan inspirations, from the goat horns to the tail, because the early Christians viewed pagan worship practiced by the unbaptized as tantamount to devil worship. In other words, the sacrament of baptism is not just a new church member being produced, but quite literally a potential demon baby being avoided. It is no coincidence, then, that deep beneath the capital, in the subterranean shunning grounds, omens congregate around the bestowal statues of Marika, except that these statues, intriguingly, are missing the jug of the sacred blessings. It seems that omens may literally be those who are born without the ritual of sacred tear blessing. In both the real world and in Elden Ring, the consequences of not performing these baptismal rites could be catastrophic. Teratology, the art of divination from malformed infants, has a long history, going back at least to ancient Mesopotamia, and the meaning of an infant born with horns would surely be interpreted as an evil portent, thus the name omen. To contain the stain of these omen births, ancients would often kill, via exposure, the affected infant. In his treatise Politics, Aristotle wrote, quote, "As to exposing or rearing the children born, let there be a law that no deformed child shall ever be reared." End quote. Likewise, we know the fate of omens born in the lands between. Those born of common folk have their horns excised, an excruciating and cruel process which kills most of those affected, leaving only a few to continue to live out their cursed lives. The lucky, if you can call it that, those born of royal blood, are spared their horns, but instead are imprisoned underground for eternity. In Elden Ring, the mere existence of these omens would surely be an intolerable affront to the sanctity of the Erdtree's blessings. Why else would the ritual of Erdtree birthing be so prominent in the iconography of the capital? Why else would the Dung Eater's curse be so loathsome? And so it's no surprise in the end that one perfumer, once tasked with bringing blessed newborns into the world, went mad in his dedication to ridding the world of evil, the sinful, the corrupted, those who had not received the sacred tear blessing, the omens. His name was Rollo, and as the first omen killer, he dedicated himself to the ceaseless hunting and purging of all such evil omens from the world. Despite their moniker, we never actually find them hunting omens. We find them in the Albinauric village, in the Volcano Manor, in the shanty town of Leyndell, and in each of these places, there isn't a single omen nearby. All of these places are full of Albinaurics. The omen killers are not just after omen, they are after anyone who was born of heretical birthing. Not everyone who innovates does so by rejecting the Erdtree entirely. Miquella, in an attempt to recreate the Erdtree, does so not just symbolically, but functionally as well. His desire to replace the Erdtree means he intends to replace its role in the lands between circle of life, and, as it has it, all throughout Elphael Brace of the Haligtree, we can find baptismal fonts identical to those found in Leyndell, as well as collection basins for its sacred tears. It seems Miquella attempted to replicate the Erdtree baptismal process in the Haligtree, just as he replicated Marika's embedding process. Now, finally, we can see the allure of the Haligtree to the misbegotten and the Albinaurics. What Miquella offered them, these misfits, born without grace and so desperate to find salvation in the promised land of the Haligtree, was a chance to be baptized, a chance to be reborn.